Amanda, will you do an old lady and go up and get that mic for me?
Sure.
It's easier for me to walk if I stand still. Christos Voskres. My mother, who is Byzantine Catholic, was supposed to come with me today, but she wasn't feeling well. So she said to make sure I said that even if I didn't do it right. So I'm going to start off by saying thank you to Sister. Every time I walk on the site at Flight 93, which hasn't been, I think, 4 times in almost 20 years, I hear violin music as I enter in my ear. And that was so similar that it had me crying. And I feel as if on my birthday, the good Lord has given me a gift of healing. So if you'll forgive me for a minute as you watch me wipe away the tears, I'll try to get back. Is it going to be hard for you if I move around?
No, I'm just trying to zoom back. Yeah.
So the only part I'm going to read, everything else will be by memory, but I wanted to do this little opening. When God speaks, do we listen is the theme of today's gathering. Within the content of the Bible and religious dogma are stories of whispers and other signs interpreted to be sent by God. Today, I plan to share a story of God and His miraculous presence on one of the worst days in our history. First, though, I want to share some personal history because Amanda already shared the professional history. And it kind of helps to stage the story because in my mind, until this day, I don't know why He picked me other than I have a big mouth and I'm stubborn. And He knew I would give testimony no matter what had transpired. So let me begin at the beginning a little bit. But before I do, with a show of hands, how many believe in angels? Keep them up. Now look around the room. What's that percentage, ladies? I'd say 99%. So no matter where I've traveled over the last almost 10 years since I first started telling the story, if it's 25 people or 500 people in the room, it averages 90 to 95% believe in angels. Another question, with a show of hands again, how many believe that they've ever encountered the presence of an angel, whether you heard, felt the presence? Now look around the room again. That's a pretty good percentage, don't you think? Now, I have a photographic memory. It's not as good as it was when it was younger, but I'll remember who those people are, and I may call on you at some point to tell your story if you're willing to give testimony. So let's start at the beginning again. I was raised in a home of 10 children. Obviously, my parents were Catholic, right? There were 5 boys and 5 girls. I was third in line, the only redhead, so that'll tell you everything you need to know. My nickname was Tiger, and I was born under the Taurus sign. So, you too? You know, right? Okay. Stubborn. My mother says I came out of the womb kissing my dad and telling her terrible things. So. They were both educators. My father was a teacher. My mom went back to school when I was 12 years old and got dual doctorates and became a professor at Penn State. She taught music and theater, and she played the violin very lovely, in a lovely manner. I was a wild child. Talked all the time about how the angels were in my room. Back then, when we're talking maybe some 60 years ago, my mother would tell me to be quiet because people would think I'm crazy. I've now convinced her that I am, and I don't really care what anybody thinks about me. I have a new attitude. If you don't feed me, you don't clothe me, you don't pay my bills, I'm not really concerned about what you think about me. So my mom says I've been like that all my life, so it's not new to her. So on 9/11, as Amanda talked to you or shared, how many remember where you were in that moment? Who might share? Who might just, come on. You wanna, so everybody can hear? You're gonna have to come up because the videos over here are moving too much. What's your name? Trudy. All right, Trudy.
9/11 at 9:05, I came out of church at St. John Christensen down at the run. Sister Cornelia and I looked up in the sky, seeing the plane circling. 15 minutes later, it hit. It went down. I've been there twice. It brings me to tears, knowing somebody that hated America came and then killed people for no reason but for their own jealousy. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else? I know that was hard. Come on, sister.
Okay, I remember it quite clearly because I was in Cleveland, Ohio. Is everybody hearing me?
Yeah.
Okay. I was in Cleveland, Ohio when this happened, and I was the principal of St. Mary Byzantine School there, and we were having our principals' monthly meeting. And all of our principals, it was the first one, because it was in September, it was the first one of the new school year. And we were all there, and the director of the government programs was going to begin his speech talking to us about the protocols for the year, and he stopped, and he said there's been a severe tragedy. And then he didn't even finish that when they told us to all go back to our schools. So I was driving another principal, but the two of us were going back, and we had passed Cleveland Hopkins Airport. And that's when this plane was being, they had them forced landing because they didn't know if this was another plane or not. And they had it isolated on the freeway, on the highway of the airport, and our road was right near that, so we could see all of this. And they had all of these, police and fire and everything circling this plane and not letting anybody off. So as we were going back to our schools, this is what we experienced. And it was very traumatic when we got back to the school because I guess a few of the teachers had heard about it, but we didn't want to tell the students yet because they would get all excited. And then we had parents starting to call about their children, and we told them if they want, they can come and pick them up. We tried to keep the kids as calm as possible, and I didn't want to tell them yet because, again, they would be all nervous because some of the parents worked down in the city of Cleveland for NASA, for the Navy offices and stuff. So and some of them, their fathers were policemen. So they were all excited. But as the parents came to take their children, pick them up, then things were okay. And everybody then went home and
The rest unfolded.
yeah, I had let the parents tell the children the way they wanted them to know what was going on, and so it all worked out. But yeah, it was very eerie because as we were driving back, usually you hear a lot of airplane noise, and we heard nothing. There was that silence except for that one plane.
Because they suspended flying for 5 days. And if you look historically, it was the first time in the continental United States that they had done that. And they brought 5,000 planes down in a 90-minute time period across the continental United States and all of the global where we have like properties that belong to the United States.
There was a local connection, I don't know if you know that. I was a school teacher not far from here at all, and we had the windows open. We're pretty sure we heard the plane go by. And we heard from our local borough mayor that the plane did go over Bethel Park.
I'm not sure if it came over Bethel Park. I know it came over Greensburg because Greensburg 911 received one of the distress calls. But we can talk. I'll take questions and everything after so that we can share. Okay. But thank you for that, and thank you, ladies, sister, for. So just like many of you, you were probably home or at work, and I was still at home when I first heard the news. I had just gone outside to start the bureau car. We called them view cars back then. And it wouldn't start. So after I kicked the tire a couple times and said some things I probably shouldn't and I can't repeat here in the church, I went in the house, I called the FBI mechanic, because they had jumped the car a couple days before. Why they didn't put a new battery in the car, I don't know, but then, who knows? And so I told him the car was down again. And unlike you, in your vehicles, you can just call the mechanic or have it towed somewhere. When you have a bureau car, you can't, because there's specialized equipment in it that requires special handling. So he told me it would take him about an hour. I went back in the house and I called my boss and said that I was going to have to cancel my morning meetings. My job required me to be out in public about 4 out of the 5 days a week. So then I went about to cancel some meetings and I turned the volume on the television down. And so when I was done, the TV was still muted, but I saw Diane Sawyer on Good Morning America with the Twin Towers behind her, and there was a gaping black hole with the flames coming out. And I thought to myself, well, that's funny. It's Tuesday. They don't usually show the movie trailers till the week before the weekend. And then I turned the volume back on, and she said, ABC News has just confirmed that a passenger plane struck the tower, one of the tower buildings. So I knew instinctively, at that point I'd been in law enforcement about 17 years. I was a police officer for about 10 before I went to the bureau. And everything inside me said that it wasn't an accident. Had it been a small plane, single engine plane with a couple passengers in it, I know there's been a lot of cases where they've got off course and they've struck buildings or they've struck the side of a mountain, but that just didn't make sense. So I watched, like many of you, as what happened next. The second plane hit the next tower. And back then we were carrying Blackberries and pagers, and my pager started going off. And then we watched the Pentagon, and then we heard about a plane that was coming past Pittsburgh, turned at Cleveland, and came in the direction of Pittsburgh, because it would have been a direct line to where? Washington, D.C. And so I know that NORAD had been sent out. It was estimated it was 10 to 11 minutes behind that plane, not knowing what was going to happen. And before we know it, we hear of what? The crash at Flight 93. That's right, in Shanksville. We hear that. So just like you, or most of you, I was in shock. But also, my dad always told me I wasn't smart enough. Wasn't smart enough not to be afraid. I was born with an overprotective gene, and that's why I always say it's Archangel Michael standing beside my side. And I often say to my daughter that when I die and I get to actually meet the angel, just not visualize him, he's going to ask me, why me? Why did he have to protect me? Because it's been a constant headache for him. But the pagers went off again. My pager went off, and a little code comes up to call the office, and I did. And they said they were looking for volunteers to go up to the Flight 93. At that point, I had a daughter with a 5-year-old grandchild. I was a little bit older, or maybe a lot older than some of the young people at the office, and at that point again, we didn't know if there was anything else coming. We weren't sure. And so I volunteered to go up and went with 2 men, one who the mechanic in what they call mobile command. Does everybody know what that is? I'm sure everybody watches FBI and CSI and everything on TV. But for those that don't, it's kind of a big RV that has communication capability. So the satellites can go up and you can talk for basically anywhere around the world with those satellites. So in front of us was a state trooper in a marked vehicle taking us up through the city. The mechanic and I were in the mobile command, and behind us was one of the counterterrorism agents. We drove in silence for 90 minutes. In that time, I don't recall a lot, except that when you trained at the academy, you were taught to kind of visualize what you might encounter so that when you jump out of the car, you do what you have to do. You've already kind of practiced in your mind what's going to happen. And that's what I did. And so when we arrived at the scene, we walked out. I got out of the mobile command. Who's been to the site? Who's been to Flight 93 Memorial? All right, quite a number. So we walked out on the bluff of where the 40 trees are now planted that kind of overlooks the boulder. If you're on that bluff, to the right of you is the boulder where the actual epicenter of the crash, and to the left is kind of the waters that I'll be talking about, the bodies of water. And so we looked out across, and I had one of the guys was on each side of me. And my first thoughts were obviously my job. I was there, ordered up there to kind of take a look at everything to see what we were going to need for immediate response. Were we going to need triage? Were we going to need chaplains? Were we going to need whatever? And to our left were a few more of the agents from the Johnstown, what they call resident agency. And to the right of us were the NTSB or FAA. I'm not really sure, I don't remember. And they were partially dressed in protective gear and down off to more as to where the plane had gone in. My first sensory perception was smell. The jet fuel had caused the small forest around the site to catch on fire. So I smelled diesel fuel, the jet fuel, and I smelled pine trees. To this day, I don't like the smell of pine trees. And if somebody's pumping diesel fuel at a gas station, I stand there holding my nose. Because it sends back, prompts the mind to go to a place that I don't want to go. Everywhere that you could survey was debris. There was this hole that we were looking at that looked like all the sand had been sucked down into it and had the impression of what I would think would have been the wings of the plane. Now, if you think, based off of the information we've been given, that the plane was traveling 594 miles an hour, its descent began at 35,000 feet, and it flipped in an inverted position and hit the ground like that. Imagine what if you would take a balsa wood plane that we used to play with. Most of us in here look to be about my age. The balsa wood planes we used to fly and set it on fire. The remnants kind of look the same on the ground. And I remember feeling as if I splintered into three people. The first one, the FBI employee that needed to report. That old thing, just the facts, that's all the bosses wanted, was just the facts, what was needed done. The mom, wondering how many mothers wouldn't get to say goodbye to their children that day. My daughter's grown with 4 children and a husband, and if she has a cold and her husband doesn't let me see her, there's a lot of problems. I'm very protective about my daughter still. And I couldn't imagine how many mothers weren't going to be able to kiss their baby goodbye. And then the third was the spiritual person, standing there wondering who in God's name would perpetrate such a crime. What I neglected to share is I told you my mom was Byzantine Catholic. Her parents came from Ukraine. My dad was Lebanese, Maronite Catholic, and his family came from Lebanon. So to sense that people of Arabic heritage, too, had been part of this terrible crime broke my heart even more. Because the family I was raised in, it was first God, second country, and then family. I was raised to believe that God was a God of love and light, not a God of hatred that would command someone to. So there was a different perspective. So that only took maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Because if you've ever been in a state of trauma, your mind kind of goes slower and stops the clock as you take in everything. So I always try to estimate how long before the next piece happened. And so as I stood there trying not to cry, because I learned early in police work, don't cry in front of the who?
The men.
The men, yeah. I was with the men. They were all men around me. I learned a long time, I think 3 weeks into my career, don't cry in front of the men. But that's exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to cry, and I wanted to drop on my knees and ask that big question most people ask when bad things happen. Why? And so as I stood there with all this rapidly going through my mind, on the waters that were now kind of, if you look at that gift table, that's kind of where the direction, where the water was from where we stood. I saw these flickers of light start to dance across the water. And I thought they were dead fish. I thought that perhaps the plane, fuel, or a part had gone in there and either disturbed or killed the fish, and now they're on top of the water and their scales are bouncing off the sunlight. Because remember that beautiful day? It was the kind of September day we wait for all summer. And that was my first impression. So as I stood there trying to gather all the information, trying to ignore what was the goriest part of what we saw in the trees, the flicker of light began to get stronger. So imagine you or me standing there, the light's happening. What's your first thought about yourself?
Crazy. Seeing things.
Losing my mind. That's right. It's too much for me. It's just too much for me to ingest. And it was the first time I called to God, not like I'm talking to you, but in my mind, to please, you sent me here to do a job, please allow me to be okay. And as I'm talking to him, the light gets very intense. It's the brightest light I've ever seen in my life. And it became more like a misty cloud. So again, what am I thinking in my mind? I've lost it. This is too much for me. I remember looking at both the men. They didn't appear to be any different. I remember looking at the guys on the field. Nobody appeared to be any different. And as I looked back up, I watched as this cloud opened up, this mist, and there stood what I call a legion of angels. And I don't even recall what I thought in that moment, except that I'd never seen something so brilliant or so beautiful in my life. When I wrote the first book, the editor at the publishing house asked me to describe the angels as best I could. And I told her there were no words in the English language that could adequately describe the beauty of that moment. But what I put in the book was that they were about as tall as we were on that bluff. So I estimate they must have been about 8 to 10 feet high, in height. They had blonde and brown hair of every color you can imagine. They had female and male features. They had colors of skin of every culture that I could imagine. And I like to place it in a line with that historically we know 93 cultures died in the Twin Towers, were affected that day. So to me, the angels represented all those the cultures that were lost. They were magnificent. But what perplexed me the most is that they were in Roman centurion garb. They were in line after line after line and row after row, kind of in like a U shape, protecting or watching the perimeter of the plane. Out in front was one angel who I knew to be Archangel Michael, and he was the only one with a saber, and it was drawn to the ground. Does anybody know what that means in military custom? Well, have you ever seen young people graduating from the military academies and their sabers are up? They march with it up. That means they've never been tried in battle. When the saber's down, it means they've been tried and they won. I didn't know that. I only learned that about a year ago. So, where's my mindset as I'm standing there watching this? What would you feel? Do the words, "Oh my God," come to mind? And I stood there and I watched them and I wondered, have I lost my mind, or am I really seeing something that's there? And about that very moment, the guys to the right who were in the protective gear ordered us off the field. The fire began to smolder again, and we had arrived in our dress, our outfits, our clothes. My car had broken down. I usually carried a bag in the trunk that had extra clothes. I was there in a black dress, or a black skirt, a white blouse, pair of stockings, and black shoes. They ordered us off the field. So as I moved off the field, I took another look at what was there, the angels, and I asked God, now sisters, don't laugh at me when I say this one. If that's you, will you show me a sign? They weren't enough. All the angels there weren't enough for me. And we walked a little ways from that cliff started coming down. And in front of us was a suitcase that had all the content. It was open, but the content was still there. It was singed, but it was all there. And one of the men said, the suitcase made it. Where's the bodies? It was the first time anybody spoke out loud. I don't recall any of us answering it. I just recall taking another step forward and looking back and saying again, God, if that's you, will you give me a sign? We walked up a little bit more, and there was a Bible laying on the floor. It was closed, singed around the edges, and just like the suitcase, one of the guys said out loud, the Bible made it, where's the bodies? And I turned around back again for the third time, and I said, God, if that's you, you really need to, show me it's you, and then I'm not losing my mind. And all of a sudden, the wind came out of nowhere, opened that Bible to Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. And this brown hawk took up off the ground, this huge brown hawk. And up until then, you didn't even hear a bird chirp. So how many would have asked God again? I didn't. I was afraid from when the nuns taught me about the lightning strikes that I better watch. But I turned back around and they were gone. And what did I do next? I pretended like nothing happened and I went back to work for 13 days. Just like all the other 1,200. When I tell this story, it's God's story. But there's families and surviving family members and 1,200 responders and recovery workers that all worked that site. It was the first time in almost 20 years of law enforcement I watched everybody work in tandem. Nobody cared if it wasn't their job to take out the garbage. They did it, and they did it gladly, because we knew we were there for two purposes: to solve an investigation and serve the families of those surviving and honor the heroes. Because in the long and the short of it, we know that they were very heroic, the passengers on that plane. And so I went back to work for a year. Never said anything to anyone. Wanted to go to the anniversary event, the first anniversary event. The day before, we get email that only essential members of the FBI were permitted to go that day. I thought, well, what does that mean? That means SWAT? That means, The SWAT team wasn't up there with the families for 12 days. I was. I'm getting to go. I walked into the boss's office without knocking. There were 7 or 8 of them sitting around the table like this talking. I pointed at him and I said, "You, I have to talk to you right now." He looked at me, and what I said to him, I don't remember. All I recall is that he picked